Indian Prime Minister will visit China for talks with President Xi Jinping this Friday. What can we expect from these talks in the run-up to the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? And as French President arrives in the U.S. for a state visit right before the German Chancellor's one-day work visit there, is the U.S.-European alliance likely to be strengthened in any way as a result of the two visits? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will visit China for informal talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping from Friday to Saturday. The visit comes against the backdrop of a series of high-level interactions between the two countries, starting from China's top diplomat Wang Yi's visit to India last December, the first high-level exchange after the Donglang border friction last summer. Military personnel from both countries faced off for 73 days in the Himalayan region before tensions eased ahead of the BRICS summit in Xiamen, China. Since then, a lot of water has flown under the bridge. What can we expect from the Xi-Modi summit this week, and what will it mean for Sino-Indian relations? I'm pleased to be joined in New Delhi by Professor Shrikant Kondapalli from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and in Beijing by Professor Zhang Junshe, Vice President of the Naval Research Institute of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Kondapalli, explain to us how is this upcoming meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi viewed in India by the press and by the academics?
Well, there is a lot of euphoria in India about the upcoming meeting between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi. Partly because we have reached a level of nadir in the bilateral relations, as you mentioned, in the Donglang area last year. Although trade has increased marginally, while we have not kept the $100 billion target, yet there has been some momentum forward. Yet I think the last year's events have had a huge impact on the bilateral relations. So to that extent, there is a lot of euphoria in India about the Prime Minister's visit to Wuhan to meet with President Xi Jinping. The expectations obviously are in terms of border stability. As you know, that the territorial dispute has not been resolved between the two countries. And last year, the number of border transgressions have increased to about 426 odd, as compared to nearly 200 the previous year. So this has resulted in some kind of instability on the territorial aspects. Secondly, there is also the issue of globalization. Both sides have had common position on globalization in terms of the countering trade protectionism.
Right.
If you compare President Xi Jinping's speech in Davos and Prime Minister Modi's speech in Davos, the common perspective on globalization and against trade protectionism is visible.
Right.
Thirdly,
Professor
in terms of
Kondapalli.
multipolarity.
Yeah. Right. Professor Kondapalli, hold
you.
it there, please. Let's go through some of the points that you mentioned just now, which I think it's very important. I hope we'll have the time to address the border issue, the globalization, and the multipolar world. Let's see how much time we have. But Professor Zhang Junshe, against what backdrop is China and India continue to warm up their relationship with this informal summit?
Well, just as you said, my counterpart in India said that ever since the Donglang military standoff last year, I think the bilateral relationship between the two countries have been improving, both economically and militarily. And also, I think it is reported that Mr. Modi's government now is facing some issues, both internally and internationally. Internally, maybe there are some critics in India say that his demonetization issue maybe is affecting the economy. And also, many people now in India think that the improvement of the bilateral relationship is in the fundamental interest of India as well as China. So most of the people in India now support the improvement of the bilateral relations. Internationally, just as you said that now both China and India support the multilateral trade system and oppose to unilateral and trade protectionism. And we know that also India is concerned about its trade of services, especially to the United States. So I think these two countries, China and India, share the common views on the free trade system. So we can find some areas and ways to strengthen the cooperation between our two countries, not only in politics, but also economy, trade, and military field.
Right. What kind of profound changes, in the words of China's top diplomat Wang Yi, that we are looking at for both countries in today's world, Professor Kondapalli, and how has these changes brought India and China together, closer, let's say?
I think the speech by Foreign Minister Wang Yi should be seen in the context of recent developments. For example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership revocation. Secondly, the Brexit by United Kingdom. The third event is in terms of climate change proposals not being implemented by several states. And the trade that has relatively less growth rates last year. This has resulted in a lot of trouble for the export-oriented economies, and the overall security situation after the missile strikes on Syria. These have impacted globally the situation, and so as large countries, India and China, looking for ways and means to stabilize the situation, at least in the Asian region. So this meeting contributes possibly for such kind of alternative perspectives.
Well, China and India together, our population make up almost 1/3 of humanity, right? So we do have a lot of weight. However, economically, we are both developing countries. Professor Zhang, what kind of common interests do China and India see in terms of, in the surrounding of these profound changes that we're talking about?
Well, I think development and security are the main focus, not only faced by China and India, also by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization members. So both countries, India and China, regard the development as the top priority for both countries. So I think these two countries should find some ways to strengthen our cooperation in all areas, including politics, economy, security, people-to-people exchanges, external exchanges, and also some mechanism building. So this is the first. On the security front, of course, there are some border disputes between the two countries, but both countries have decided not to let the border issue to overshadow the cooperation between our two countries. I think this is a good sign. And actually, China has already put forward the proposal to other countries where we have disputes with other countries to set aside disputes and seek joint development, seek cooperation. Actually, China has resolved the land border issues with 12 neighbors out of its 14 neighbors. So I'm sure China and India will find some ways to overcome their obstacles that in front of them.
Professor Kondapalli, earlier you mentioned the perceived Chinese activities into Russian territory, if I understand you correctly. How much confidence is there among Indian observers that the border issue will be kept under control, at least not to disrupt the warming political and economic relations between these two countries?
Well, on the borders, we have 6 arrangements on confidence-building measures, starting with the 1970s and then Peace and Tranquility Agreement. When President Jiang Zemin visited India, we had CBMs in the military field, in the conventional field, Then later on we added the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement and a host of other tactical level confidence building measures. So I think overall there is peace and tranquility on the border. Of course, the Xiamen meeting, both the leaders suggested that there will be additional CBMs in the future. So this meeting in Wuhan possibly would result in much more arrangements in terms of qualitatively enhancing the CBMs between the two and possibly more stability on the border areas. But I would like to come back again to one of the recent developments, that is the missile strikes on Syria. I think the last 4 or 5 years the energy prices are relatively low at about $52 per barrel. Now it has increased to roughly about $72 per barrel, and in this year we are expecting the energy prices to spike around $80 per barrel. As the largest consumers of energy resources, China is the second largest importer of energy. India is the third largest importer of energy. So as largest consumers of energy, the Syrian developments would have a huge impact in terms of energy consumption, energy imports. So the meeting in Wuhan would also possibly address this issue of what to do with energy prices increase, because this is going to pinch the GDP figures of China and India if they do not take measures in this regard.
Yeah, Professor Zhang, what is the Chinese understanding of what will be talked about and what possible outcome can we expect from the Xi-Modi meeting in Wuhan?
Well, I think just as I say, maybe development and security are the focus of maybe the topics discussed between the leaders of the two countries. And China maybe, India maybe is looking forward for more investment from China. And also China wants to cooperate with India in many fields, economy, trade, and also the people-to-people exchanges. And also we can see that on the military front that the relations are also improving. So maybe we can discuss the possibility of the resumption of the annual joint military exercise and other confidence building measures. Both the measures will cover economy, trade, and military.
Yeah. Finally, about 30 seconds left. Professor Kondapolli, actually Prime Minister Modi will visit China in June as well to attend the upcoming summit, 18th summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a new member which joined last year. So how special is this for Prime Minister Modi to visit China in such a short span of time twice?
I think this is signaling to China that India values its relations with China, and the spirit of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is number one, territorial dispute resolution or territorial stability, number one, energy security, number three, counter-terrorism peace mission exercises, number four, multipolar world. I think these are valuable to India as well, and we can make possibly some truck with each other on these four main issues.
Okay.
During this meeting
we have to
and
leave it
also
there.
in Qingdao.
Yeah, we have to leave it there. Sorry to interrupt you, Professor Kondapolli, joining us from India. He is professor from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and many thanks to Professor Zhang Jingshi, Vice President of China's Naval Research Institute here in Beijing. And you're watching The Point with me, Li Xin. We'll take a short break, and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us. French President Emmanuel Macron began a 3-day state visit to Washington on Monday. That will be an important opportunity for the Trump administration to strengthen the transatlantic alliance and reinforce U.S. priorities in Europe. Macron is the first foreign leader hosted by the Trump White House for a state visit, and his trip comes in the wake of France's participation alongside the UK in the U.S.-led airstrikes in Syria. Meanwhile, the EU signaled its intention to join the consultation requested by China with the U.S. at the World Trade Organization on U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs. And as if this is not complicated enough, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is to visit Washington immediately after Macron, but only for a one-day working visit. So what is likely to be achieved by these two visits, and is the US-European alliance likely to be strengthened in any way as a result? I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Joe Rubin and Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Rubin, explain to us, why is the French leader given the state visit honor and nobody else so far yet?
Thank you. And yes, Emmanuel Macron was given a great honor by President Trump in being the first foreign leader to have a state visit for him here in the United States. And this is a real symbol for President Trump of his affection for Macron. Last year, when President Trump visited France, he was treated on Bastille Day to a similar type of visit by the French. He was hosted well, and President Trump seemed to really enjoy that. And it appears that he does have a strong affinity for Emmanuel Macron's advice and presence. So it's very personal for President Trump.
Mr. Macron, does it surprise you that the French leader is given such honor, given the huge difference in views that he holds on issues with President Trump on issues such as climate change, globalization, trade? Does this surprise you?
It really does. Clearly, this is a personal choice by President Trump. Now, Emmanuel Macron did support President Trump's recent airstrikes against Syria, which sort of cemented this relationship on a policy level. But you're right, there are major differences, be it on the Iran nuclear deal, global climate change, even Russia, where Macron spoke out against Russian meddling in his election. He spoke very forcefully, as opposed to President Trump, who barely talked about it. So there are significant differences, but it does really seem like President Trump, again, views the personal as more important than the policy. Clearly, this visit demonstrates that.
Mr. Cameron, in Brussels, let me ask you the same question then. Comparing the policies and personalities, do the differences between these two leaders outweigh their differences? Outweigh their similarities,
yes, I think
sorry.
They're both Yeah, I think they're both political mavericks. They're not particularly ideological. They both have a business background. And despite their difference in age and temperament, I think they both want to make deals. And so they're both prepared to overlook their differences to try and come up with, firstly, a good personal relationship, and I think that's been cemented over the last day and will continue for the rest of the state visit, but also seeking ways to actually work together in a practical way, whether it's on Iran, whether it's on trade, and so on. So I think this really is a very important visit for both sides.
Why is the French leader so important for President Trump? Mr. Cameron, still with you. Does he need Mr. Cameron's support on some of the issues, or does he view France as being a very important leader of the European bloc? What is on the mind of President Trump? What does he want to get out of this?
Well, firstly, France has increased in importance, partly because of Brexit. So Theresa May has been weakened, if you like. So has Chancellor Merkel after the last election. So Macron is really viewed throughout the continent and throughout the world as the leader of Europe. So that's the first point. Secondly, I think Trump wants, as I say, to be able to do deals with someone. And he wants to go to the top and cut a deal with Macron, and Macron's not going to give up his principles on the issues that we have mentioned, but there's going to be first a better understanding, which is important, and probably the most one can hope from as a result of this visit, and then they can move on to try and work out how to narrow their differences on the big issues of the day, whether it's trade, Iran, and so on.
Rubin, in Washington, D.C., how do you look at the kind of interest that President Trump might get out of by welcoming Macron, on views with regard to globalization? They're really opposing each other, right? Is there any possibility of reconciliation?
It's hard to say if there will be a reconciliation. President Trump tends to agree with the last person that he's spoken with. That's been a trend on a variety of issues. And so he may very well come out and demonstrate that he agrees with Emmanuel Macron on the importance of NATO, the European Union, not starting a trade war with China. He may say all of those things, and then as soon as Macron leaves, he may change his tune. So we really don't know, and that's the danger that we have with these kinds of visits. What we don't want is a situation where Emmanuel Macron comes here, has a great visit, and then President Trump undermines the visit and embarrasses Macron back at home. Macron is taking a risk by coming so close to President Trump right now, a political risk at home and in Europe. But the Europeans do want him to succeed. So this is a highly risky trip for Macron, and hopefully President Trump will be sensitive to that.
Mr. Macron, what is high on the agenda for President Macron? Is it trade issue? Because we know steel and aluminum tariffs very important, very detrimental potentially to the European Union. Or is it the Iran deal that the European governments try to save?
Certainly trade matters and the climate change negotiations
Mr. Cameron, please.
as well.
Mr. Cameron, in Brussels, please.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. I think both are really important. Domestically, for the European economy, it's important that we don't have a trade war, so getting a permanent exclusion from Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium on 1st of May is highly important. And then 2 weeks later comes the deadline on the Iran deal, which the Europeans have invested enormously in, and I think they, along with Russia and China, most other countries of the world, believe is the best way to keep the Iran nuclear ambitions in a box. So I think they're equally important, one that more for domestic and one more for foreign policy.
In terms of the German Chancellor's upcoming visit, Mr. Rubin, how is that visit seen, especially the fact that it comes on the heels of Mr. Macron's visit? Is it just a coincidence, or how do you explain the timing?
Yeah, no, the timing is intentional. There is a serious lobbying effort right now underway by the Europeans, in particular here clearly with Germany and France, to ensure that President Trump does not break the Iran nuclear deal. They have a lot invested in it. The Europeans spent many years engaging in diplomacy with Iran, even before the United States supported that during the Bush administration in the early Obama years. It was Europe that was really active on the diplomatic front. And so they have a lot invested in this nuclear deal. It is a symbol not only of the power of diplomacy, but also of European unity. And if the United States breaks the deal, it will demonstrate a split between the United States and Europe that could be very damaging to our security arrangements going forward. So the French and the Germans in particular want to keep Donald Trump in this deal for a variety of reasons, not just security, but also for the long-term Western alliance.
Right. Basically, there is a split, right, happening within the Western bloc between camps that support globalization and camps that are against globalization. Mr. Cameron, in Brussels, how do you look at the risk of this split being wider as a result of a failed visit either by Macron or Mrs. Merkel?
Well, the split is not just between countries, it's between segments of the population. I mean, Trump doesn't speak for all Americans, and Macron only won the French election with a very narrow victory. So there are anti-globalization movements in Europe as well as the United States and elsewhere. At the moment, I think we have to work through Macron and Merkel as the champions of a pro-free trade, and Britain too for the moment, in terms of trying to ensure that Trump doesn't go completely off the rails in terms of blowing up the WTO. The US, for example, is dragging its heels, basically blocking the appointment of any new judges to the WTO just now. So it's a very dangerous approach in the Trump administration. So I think the European leadership we have at present is trying to modify and try to mitigate what Trump is up to.
And at this moment, again, staying with Mr. Macron in Brussels, what kind of likelihood is Mrs. Merkel going to come home with what she hopes for?
I don't think anyone is going to walk out and claim victory. It would not be the right thing to do. I think what they want to do at the end of the week is say each has a better understanding of where the other side is coming from. Hopefully Trump will maybe say, well, let's look again at the deal now that Europe has come up with some modifications to the Iran deal. Hopefully he will also exclude Europe permanently from the tariffs, and that would be enough, I think, for Merkel and Macron each to claim a success. But they will not do it loudly. They will want to make sure that each side walks away saying that relations are on a good, even level.
Mr. Rubin, how would you describe if Mr. Macron's visit would be a success or not? What will we be looking for?
Ultimately, a success will be where the President Trump, pulls back from his threats to the Iran nuclear deal, begins to not just mouth the words of the value of relations with Europe, but begins to really change American policy in terms of engaging European countries on trade issues, not through threats, but through cooperative discussions. That is the task for Emmanuel Macron, as well as other leaders like Justin Trudeau of Canada, with whom the President also enjoys a good relationship. Changing the tone of this President on international affairs is critical. He has a new team in the White House. He'll have a new Secretary of State most likely within the coming weeks. So he has a chance for a redo, and Emmanuel Macron is trying to position himself to tell the President, this is how you can show global leadership rather than attacking your allies, bringing us in. And that would be a success.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Jill Rubin and Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. And here is my point. The world is really undergoing profound change, and in today's show we were able to address some of the most significant aspects. China and India as the two biggest developing countries trying to expand their common ground, putting their differences behind them. Within the Western world, forces for and against globalization are trying to strengthen their alliance while holding on to their opposing views, at least for the moment. The world is indeed at a juncture, if not a crisis. So where does the future lie? Answers on a postcard, please. That is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.